Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, I'm talking to the historian of science, Simon Schaffer, about a revolution that some people believe is the one that really did change everything, the scientific revolution. In this conversation, we touch on quite a few things that we've talked about before, including quite recently, on Past, Present, Future, humanism and the Reformation, Thomas Hobbes and his Leviathan, Jonathan Swift and Gulliver's Travels. This is a wide-ranging conversation, but at its heart is one really big question. Was there such a thing as the scientific revolution? And if there was, what does it mean? Simon, maybe we should start with the big question, which is whether there was such a thing as the scientific revolution. It's a term that has been widely adopted. It's almost taken for granted, but also, I think, increasingly questioned. Are you happy to talk about such a thing as the scientific revolution? And if so, when was it?
I'm very happy to talk about the scientific revolution with the kinds of caveats that historians often introduce here. Two seem to me to matter for the conversation. One, the concept of the scientific revolution is far more distributed in public culture than it is in specialist culture. That's very interesting to me. In other words, here is an example, in terms of history of ideas, of an idea which is much more credible outside the world of specialists. And I think that raises all sorts of interesting questions. Second reason why I think it's actually really important to talk about the scientific revolution is because all the themes that phrase raises are of great importance to understanding the emergence of modernity, the status of European culture in comparison with others, and I think above all, how the very notion of science came to mean what it means for us now. All three parts of the term, so there was only one, scientific, as opposed to what? The humanities, the arts, culture, religion, other forms of belief, magic. Very, very interesting questions. Revolution. Well, for example, how quick does a revolution have to be a revolution? I guess for a great deal of the period in which even the very phrase was used, the scientific revolution as a singular event after which something recognizably like our modernity came into existence was at least 2 centuries, maybe 3. So the well-institutionalized period that's always thought of is, roughly speaking, from the middle of the 1400s to the middle of the 1700s. That's 300 years. Is a process that lasts 300 years revolutionary? Isn't it just history? All those questions are really interesting for the history of ideas.
And on the first, but it relates to the last, when did the term come to be used in a self-conscious way, and by whom? So can we date the term, even if we can't date the event, can we date when people started to talk about or think about something called the scientific revolution?
I think we can. I think we've got basically 2 candidates. They're both, for me, absolutely fascinatingly 20th century. We are talking about the early to mid 1900s. In North America, from the period of the First World War and then massively in the interwar period, you start to see the phrase the scientific revolution, meaning something roughly like what we just tried to describe. The appearance of a new form of thought in Europe, they meant mainly Western and Northern Europe, associated with the natural sciences above all, notably astronomy, mathematics, and mechanics. And in exactly the period that I've described. So from round about the 1480s to round about the 1780s. And this was associated with, in fact, it was taken to be by some the consequence, by some the driving force of what it was that specially marked out modern European industrial society. And then during and immediately after the Second World War, the term became a very, very particular way, not only of describing what had happened in that period, but who was going to tell you about it. Up till then, the phrase the scientific revolution, by and large, was the property of humanists, historians, cultural commentators. It appeared in works of vast chronological scope. You found it in school books. You found it in New Yorker cartoons. And to put it bluntly, that means wide, not universal, but wide cultural distribution. From the 1940s, it became a specialist term. And this was very much the responsibility of a complicatedly connected group of newfangled historians of science. And the task of chronicling and then indeed explaining the scientific revolution became the job of this group of historians of science. And for at least one, probably two generations, so way, way into the 1970s, so for about 30 to 40 years, explaining and documenting the scientific revolution defined this project within history, within a particular approach to historical modernity. And the claims made for the scientific revolution were, which is one of the reasons we're interested in it, really dramatic. So the historians who not only helped invent but define this concept would say that this was an event, I paraphrase, that dwarfed every other historical transformation, that reduced events like the Renaissance and the Reformation to the level of mere episodes, that provided the single most important task, not just within this tiny group of specialists, historians of science, but for the whole of historical understanding. It was an extraordinarily dramatic and radical claim. And finally, of course, it immediately spawned, which is why I'm so interested in it, corresponding questions. Like, given that the scientific revolution as it was then defined was defined almost purely intellectually, so it was a transformation of ideas, and given that those ideas allegedly were proper to really quite small groups of thinkers in a particular region of Europe, you could ask questions, and these questions were asked extremely influentially. Why didn't anyone else have a scientific revolution? And a great example of that, one that presses on us a great deal now because of its irony, if nothing else, was what was called the Needham question formulated by the great Cambridge-based biochemist and expert on China, Joseph Needham, Christian socialist and Marxist. And Needham made himself the master of the historiography of science and technology in China, and then asked this question: why was there no scientific revolution in China? This became a question of ordering not just discussions about early modern European thinking, but about global history and its meaning now.
So I want to come back to the China question. But if, as this term, first of all, as you say, very interesting, first of all gets widely used and then gets more narrowly used, but in both uses, the understanding is something hugely dramatic happened, and before and after this event, nothing was quite the same. And as this term became ubiquitous, that assumption gets baked into all sorts of histories of the period. To what extent did it depend on a belief that this is how it was experienced by the people who lived through it? And to what extent did it completely discount that question? So they weren't calling it the scientific revolution, I don't think. they were aware that they were doing something new. And we can talk about the emblematic figures in this story, Francis Bacon or Galileo, whoever it is. I mean, it's not like these people didn't realize something big was going on. But when people started to call it a revolution, did it or did it not matter to them that the people that they were writing about and fitting into this story did not think of themselves as revolutionaries?
I think that's one of the most fundamental issues of the whole concept, because what the concept carries with it is certainly what we might call a sociology of knowledge, that the folk who matter are the folk who think well. And the claim was that this very dramatic change was, to quote from one of the historians who really made the notion of the scientific revolution very popular, an historian called Herbert Butterfield. For Herbert Butterfield, writing in the 1940s, in the immediate wake of the Second World War, the scientific revolution was a question of, and the phrase is so dated, it tells you exactly when he was writing, putting on a new thinking cap. Well, thinking caps may not be familiar to us now, but thinking caps were a notion of bourgeois education. And the idea was, it was pretty explicit, that a very particular kind of person doing a very particular kind of thinking had not only been responsible for this extraordinarily dramatic change, but that almost no one else was. So the relationship between this transformation in the account of how the world is and the account of how you should find out how the world is, so both description and method, that change was their responsibility and definitely not the responsibility of anybody else. And therefore, any evidence that by and large general ideas had not changed so dramatically, in a certain sense, didn't count. That didn't matter. It didn't matter very much that mid 18th century popular culture didn't differ dramatically from mid 16th century popular culture. If that was the claim, it didn't tell against the claim that there had been a revolutionary change elsewhere amongst this group. And secondly, exactly as you're implying, there was a certain amount of attention paid to the self-consciousness of these thinkers, but the self-consciousness always apparently needed to be translated. So in some respects, it was easy to translate. I'll give you one example, which is the change in the significance of the word new. Until certainly, I would say, the late 1500s, it was widely understood, even and in a certain sense, especially in erudite and learned circles, that new meant wrong, that they were synonyms almost. So novatores, the people with new stuff to offer, were charlatans, deceitful, frauds, deluded, and certainly heretics. I mean, heresy and novelty are absolutely the same thing. So, especially, I would say, with the advent of movable type and then popular print, with the advent of systematic knowledge production out with the universities and new kinds of institutions ranging from print shops to ports to courts, there we see books which have the word new in their title, and that's a good thing. The spectacular example of this, of course, perhaps the most familiar example of it, is that there was a new world. From the late 1400s, Europeans knew that there was another world. And the association between novelty and the Americas is fundamental. The analogy is often made, therefore, between European encounters with New World populations, human and non-human, and European encounters with other forms of novelty in the heavens, above all. So the number of works in astronomy from the 1580s onwards that use the word new in their title is vast. New stars, comets, objects, structures, and so on. But not just in astronomy, in natural history, in chemistry, and so on. So that is possible to translate into the framework of the scientific revolution extremely easily. Francis Bacon's masterly utopian vision of how science should be organized in this short and readable book, published posthumously, called The New Atlantis, brought all that together. This is a world situated somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, in his imagination, which is reached by navigation, which is run by men of knowledge, which is ruthlessly homosocial and hierarchical, which conducts experiments, which is funded by public money, and which advances knowledge. All of that was very easy to associate with the idea of a revolutionary change, unprecedented, sudden, dramatic, and recognized. On the other hand, it's extraordinarily difficult to translate most of what is said and done by early modern thinkers, experimenters, naturalists, astronomers, natural philosophers into the language of self-conscious revolutionary change. And the reason it's difficult is because it wasn't there. We are not talking, by and large, about large groups of people who believe they are undergoing this kind of dramatic change that the historians of the scientific revolution believed they were modeling, especially in detail. So it's a fascinating case where some examples of what folk were thinking at the time, especially those select folk were thinking and saying and doing, could easily be recuperated to the model of the revolution. Others, vast areas of their activity, could not be so recuperated, and they tended either to be ignored or translated in a fascinating way. And an example, which we may well come on to, is religious belief. That is to say, was the scientific revolution the same as the disenchantment of the world?
I want to ask you about that. I want to ask you one more thing about the word new, because the two examples that you gave there are two very different ways of understanding the word new. So a new star, a new world, these are things that aren't new, they're old, but they're new to us. Like they're new because they've come across our observational space, and so they appear novel. But what we're trying to do is explain them in terms which do not emphasize their novelty. They fit into a wider scheme of understanding. Whereas a new society, a society organized along these scientific revolutionary principles, is something new. There are no societies like that until such a one comes along. And the scientific revolution encompasses both of these things. So on the one hand, it is, if it is a revolution, it is the revolution of people who have seen things that haven't been seen before, but not because what they are therefore doing is creating a new world, they are merely observing it. And at the same time, the implication in the way that people use the term is that they are also making a new world. Am I right in assuming that those two things really do not necessarily go together?
The claim is, and it was made at the time by many, that it was new technique, it was new practice, it was new method, it was a new way of making and building and acting in the world that at last allowed humans to see how things really were.
So the telescope would be the standard example.
The telescope is the supreme example, certainly in literature, where a device is made so that for the first time, one can see how things are. And the choice of emphasis between these two themes, that is to say, the notion of restoration and the notion of absolute novelty, is, in my view, the stuff of early modern knowledge crises. Balancing out those two claims was extraordinarily difficult, especially in Western Europe, where you have culture dominated by a form of theology and a form of what we might call, should call, moral culture, which believes that there was a moment when everything was known. And that if there's stuff we don't know now, it's because it's been lost, not because it was unknown. And there's one man whose name we know extremely well, who knew everything, and his name is Adam. And the task of organized knowledge is to restore us to the situation humanity was in before the fall, when it was represented by this unique individual. And Bacon absolutely had that view. His view was that by action, by the use of instruments, by the conduct of experiments, by, as he puts it, the enlargement of the arts, or as we would say, the development of technology, humans could return to Eden. And that is a theme that completely dominates 17th century writings about the new philosophy, as they called it. The new philosophy was very widely understood as not a revolution in our sense, that is to say, a break with the past and a move to a completely different order, but a revolution in the older sense, that's to say, a cycle, a return to something that we once had and have now lost because of sin. The irony that Adam was thrown out along with Eve, not so much because of eating fruit, but because the fruit was knowledge, is much commented on. So Robert Hooke, brilliant experimental natural philosopher and architect, chief experimenter for the Royal Society of London from the 1660s to the 1690s, claimed that with these new instruments, microscopes, telescopes, air pumps, humans were returning to the condition they were in before the fall. So there's a phrase in one of the more important propaganda books of the 1660s written in English that Adam needed no spectacles, that Adam could feel the earth orbit the sun. He could feel the blood circulate round the body. So the answer to your question, is there a relation between finding stuff that was already there but not yet known and doing new things, is no. There was a very close relation between them, because for many of the people we're thinking about, it wasn't a question simply of finding out things that were there but not known, but of recapturing knowledge that had been lost.
So that's one of the ways in which the conventional story, which is the scientific revolution, was a kind of modern liberation of human understanding from superstition and magic and all the rest. What you've just described is a very close relationship between technology and sin, basically. Technology is the thing that is needed by sinful creatures because they can't see for themselves, presumably because they have been corrupted, including their sight has been corrupted. And these instruments are the means by which that corruption can be overcome. Even that makes it sound like the lines that the conventional story draws between a pre-scientific revolution world and the world that is created are very blurry.
I think they're not just very blurry. Some of them simply aren't there. These are, in some cases, borders that don't exist. The record is full of examples of folk who, perhaps to our surprise, held that they were rediscovering lost truths. Good example is Isaac Newton. Newton absolutely believed that the fundamental principles of what we think of as the Newtonian world were known to the ancients and to Noah, and then lost. And they were lost, Newton claims, because of corruption, moral, sinful corruption, which left its trace first and foremost in politics and religion. In other words, for Newton, the rise of Catholicism in general, the papacy in particular, priestcraft, as he calls it. And so for Newton, what he was doing was indeed a dramatic change in history. He held himself to be one of the adepts who could reverse this catastrophe. So he's a fantastic example. He actually wrote down about his most important book, The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. He writes, "I did not discover this. I brought it back to light and demonstrated it was true." So that then links not just technologies of practice, but also technologies of argument to this notion of restoration. And it seems to me, I'm not proposing that we change the slogan to the scientific restoration, but that does a bit more justice to what was happening across wide swathes of natural knowledge in this period. And exactly as you say, the notion that humans need technique because they fell, because the gap between their capacities and those of nature was first of all created and then grew. That seems to me to be a fundamental notion in the very model that we have of the scientific revolution.
Then, in that story, a word that you used is experiment. You could be an experimenter. And that also connects to another word that connects to the word art, which is artifice or artificial. You can create artificial scenarios because they are human made, they are deliberately designed to reveal something about the world. And again, I think it's true that for most people, the idea of the scientific revolution, if it means anything, is a move from a reliance on traditional authority and knowledge passed down, and it's true because it's in the Bible or it's in Aristotle or whatever, to a world in which these brave new scientists were using their own eyes to conduct experiments and to try and replicate those experiments and to be skeptical and only believe it when it had been confirmed by the evidence. And yet, if we are fallen and sinful creatures and we can't see for ourselves without the use of telescopes, how did they square that circle? How can you both be the arbiter of truth because you've seen it with your own eyes, and also the creatures who, since the fall, have been incapable of seeing things for what they really are? I mean, it's a basic problem of experimental science, which is about how reliable the evidence is if it's human beings who have to witness it. How did they square that circle? They presumably recognized the tension in that, the idea that this new age of experiment also put a premium on humans judging what they see for themselves. That's the thing that's unreliable in this story.
It's absolutely the case that, certainly as I see it, the fundamental problem of the eruption of experimental practice and experimental knowledge in early modern Europe is perhaps more than anything else a problem of communication, what we might now call quality control and fake news. So that if one thinks about it for a moment, imagine that the claim is that one should only believe what one has seen for oneself. Imagine that that's the slogan. Under those circumstances, the problem is distribution. The problem is, how does an event or a phenomenon that I have seen come to be accepted by folk who have not? So there was an integral entanglement between the systems of reporting, of news, the other crucial early modern sense of the new, which was news, the novel, the newspaper, and so on, and the establishment of authoritative matters of fact. So between the late 1500s and the early 1700s, the construction of really quite complicated, quite sophisticated, but extraordinarily fragile systems of managing, distributing, and organizing direct experience so that it can be communicated to others, so that it can be shared, and so that the right degrees, as they would have seen it, of obligation, authority, and deference are reinforced. This is how it comes to pass in this period that we see so clearly that solutions to the problem of knowledge, in other words, how do I know what you're telling me is so, are solutions to the problem of social order. Why should I assent? Why do I feel obliged by what you tell me? So the problem of news and the problem of experiment are essentially the same problem. And they're dealt with artful and ingenious forms of social organization and of material organization. social organization in terms not just of direct witnessing, because that doesn't multiply the number of folk who ought to feel obliged to believe enough. So forms of writing, of distributing reports, of organizing those reports, of, for example, naming the people who saw the event. And in an ideal world, the social status of the people who saw the event should be very high because they seem to be more credible. And as you can well imagine, even and in a certain sense, particularly in 17th century Europe, the thought that folk of high social status are more credible is easy to challenge, very easy to challenge. That was extraordinarily difficult to secure. And then on the materials side, the construction of increasingly ingenious and complex devices that would produce phenomena of such clarity that one could bring to presence, one could show, one could make manifest, demonstrate in that sense, demonstration as showing, all of that was a way, it was hoped, of solving the problems of reliability, obligation, authority, and deference. So these were questions very high on the agenda, not just in cases that are presumably relatively familiar, like, for example, the enterprises of Robert Hooke and Robert Boyle in Oxford and London, but also in other sites of Western Europe, in Paris, in the Italian lands and the German lands, in the Netherlands above all, where groups gathered, print shops were organized to distribute their stories, and above all, you see the emergence of what historians call a republic of letters. This is a republic of letters because it's so fascinated by the practice of writing, and it's a republic of letters because it's bound together by communication networks. And that system was supposed, at least in principle, to solve these problems. It didn't. But what it has as aim is very interesting for us. I think really important for us. Now, the fact that this was not completely successful, that matters of dispute, not just around particular facts, but whole crises of authority kept on erupting way into the 1700s, shows us how simultaneously necessary and fragile the systems built during this period actually were.
For that clarity, to what extent was language one of the problems that needed to be solved? So one question is just whether there could be a universal language in which this could be communicated. The universal language of Europe had been Latin, but Latin is probably not going to work for this. I don't know whether this is part of the conventional view of the scientific revolution, but that it was a move towards the use of other forms of communication, including diagrams and charts, but also numbers, crucially. So mathematics could be the universal language. It's not subject to all the vagaries of how human beings interpret terms. So maths could be one answer, but another answer could be, to bring in another 17th century figure, Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher, his politics, which is, in this world, if you need precision and clarity, it's going to have to be politically imposed by someone who tells you what words mean. You can't rely on language because we all see it differently. Words mean different things to different people. They are used and abused by people for their own purposes. And only a strong central authority can impose the kind of precision on language that would allow this form of communication. And it's always under threat from people, particularly from those with religious claims, who say they have their own language of truth. This is too sort of extreme a choice, but maths at one end, numbers, is one way around the problem of the unreliability of language. Strong states is another. But those feel like two very, very different visions of the world that is being created by this new science. And they coexisted, didn't they?
Absolutely. There are really important connections, of course, between the insistence, as Galileo puts it, that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. That's what Galileo says. And his claim, therefore, is that only mathematicians, or at least those skilled in mathematics, by which he overwhelmingly means geometry, can decode, can decipher the world. Well, that's a form of authoritarianism. There were those who argued, Robert Boyle is one of them, for example, that the mathematical model of communication is tyrannic and exclusive and dogmatic. Robert Boyle unambiguously associates a certain mathematical style in communicating and describing, for example, experiments, as a form of tyrannic dogmatism. Robert Boyle, for whom, at least in his writing, the chief ethical values were humility and modesty, mathematics is the antithesis of that. Mathematics is about certainty and exclusivity, not humility and modesty. And there are passages in Boyle which are quite dramatic on this question. Mathematicians, says Boyle, are perfectly capable of describing experiments that have not been done. So for Boyle, a thought experiment is sinful because you're describing something you cannot do. And that begins to open up, it seems to me, the space of what the relation between politics and language is. I think there are two other issues there that are very important. The standard version of the scientific revolution that we inherited from our teachers of the mid-20th century insisted that one of the principal effects and causes, almost simultaneously, of what they called the scientific revolution was the insistence on plain language, the loathing of and the attempt to expel rhetoric from talk about the world. And certainly some of the most important propagandists of the new philosophy in the 17th century notoriously did mount really fierce claims, fierce arguments against rhetoric, using, inevitably, rhetoric to do so. So the seductive powers of language, which they claimed removed what is real from what is thought, needed to be exorcised somehow. And it turned out rhetoric is a very good way of exorcising rhetoric, inevitably.
In the same way that Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, which is a book against metaphor, is a giant metaphor.
Related to that, I would say, is that there is nevertheless a dream of another language in early modern natural knowledge, a language which would, as it were, move beyond the mathematics that we've inherited from the ancients to a language which matched things as they are perfectly. And the project for such a universal language is a dominant theme amongst European intellectuals of that period, both for political and for natural philosophical reasons. For political reasons, because if only everyone not only had the same ideas but expressed them in the same way, using the same signs, disputes would cease. So there's a good political reason to have standardized languages. And the Hobbesian project, which is the magistrate will determine meaning, is obviously a way of doing that. In other words, a state is a dictionary plus an army. That's essentially the argument. There were, on the other hand, claims, these are very common in the early Royal Society in London and very common elsewhere, that what we really need is a language each of whose signs corresponds to a thing. And as usual, the writer who seized on the significance but also the silliness of that idea best is Jonathan Swift. So in the third book of Gulliver's Travels, the academicians in the flying island of Lagado have the wonderful idea that because speech damages our lungs so much by the passage of air, it would be better if we never spoke at all and if we simply communicated with things. So the academicians wander the streets of the flying island with servants carrying enormous sacks of things. And when they wish to have a conversation, they stop, they face each other, the servants empty the sacks, and they have conversations simply by showing each other things. And then when they finished, all the things go back in the sack and they wander off. And someone's wisdom, Swift's Gulliver points out to us, is measured by the size of the sack their servant is carrying. Well, that's an amazingly brilliant joke, but it's not very far away from some of the ideas that Swift was very familiar with that had in fact been proposed, that there should be a language of things. And one way of thinking better about what early modern natural history, early modern classification, the work of writers like Linnaeus in Sweden or John Ray in England amount to is an attempt to make language, to make the terms of language correspond better and better and better to things as they are. Again, the ideal of that is Adam. It's Adam who had the perfect language, the Adamic language. In Adam's world, he knew the names of things. He saw a camel and he called it camel because that's its name. And we lost all that knowledge. And the aim of natural history is to recover it. So along with mathematics and with the purification of language for political and scientific reasons, there's an attempt to construct a language of things, a table, a universal table that we could simply consult.
And what's so interesting about it is, as you describe it, it is simultaneously the word that we would use is utopian, and that's what Swift is satirizing. And yet it's closely connected to the Hobbesian example of this. It's closely connected to what we sometimes also think of as a realist notion of power. It leads to the idea that you need a strong state to control language.
These are already absolutely on the agenda in the relation between early modern political thought and early modern natural scientific thought. I mean, they're there in these debates quite explicitly.
That image of the wisest man is the man whose servant has the biggest sack touches on another question that relates to the conventional view of the scientific revolution, which was it placed a premium on certain kinds of disinterested knowledge, that the scientific revolution took science beyond the grubby world of church and religion and wars of religion and 15th and 16th and 17th century European politics. There was some higher plane to which it ascended. And yet, you've touched on this, someone had to pay for it. Social status was an absolutely crucial part of proving your bona fides as a reliable observer. And this is still a world in which a lot of social status comes from the church anyway. To be a bishop is to have high social status. So you simultaneously should be a good scientist and you're the enemy of science because you're a bishop. And also, none of this is new in the sense that technical knowledge was always at the service of the state. They weren't called states then, but at the service of political powers looking for better ways of fighting war, better ways of extracting value from the people over whom they ruled, and so on. So it goes back to that question of novelty. Was there something in the thing that we call the scientific revolution that did fundamentally shift the relationship between the pursuit of knowledge and the people who might either fund it or benefit from it? Or is that another thing where the line isn't really there?
I think, again, the line around or the border that is moving around legitimation, support, patronage, funding, that line is extremely fluid in the period that we're thinking about. So that, for example, it's undoubtedly the case that the period that's been associated with the scientific revolution is also unambiguously a period when court society, the society of the rulers and the institutions that surround the rulers, becomes not at all for the first time. This is not unprecedented, but it's extremely intense, and it's clearly being intensified. These institutions become hugely important institutions of knowledge making, are not just of support for knowledge, in other words, but of its reorganization. So it's quite striking that some of the most dramatic and obvious new sciences, and they were called new sciences at the time, Galileo uses the phrase two new sciences to describe the sciences of strong materials and the science of mechanics and above all ballistics. These new sciences not only are supported by, they become possible through the organization of the state. I'll give you two examples. One is astronomy. Until the middle of the 1500s, the task of astronomy is to make mathematical predictions about future states of observable bodies in the heavens, notably the planets. And astronomers, as mathematicians, were allowed to invent models, provided those models generated reliable predictions, numerical predictions of position and time. It was not supposed that these models were true. They simply worked. And this was allowed because mathematicians had extraordinarily low status. They were, to put it bluntly, very badly paid. They were the worst paid professors at medieval universities. The best paid professors at medieval universities were medics and theologians and lawyers, who were concerned with much more important questions of human concern. Where, therefore, did that situation change? Because change it did. During the 1500s, small groups of mathematicians began not only to continue to make accurate mathematical predictions, they began to construct models of the heavens that they claimed were true. Notably and famously, the claim that the Earth is a planet. Well, almost without exception, the mathematicians and astronomers who made that shift were working at court, and they were not, by and large, working in universities. So, for example, Galileo had up till 1609, 1610, been a very badly paid university professor at Pisa and then in Padua. And when he constructed his telescope and revealed truths about how the heavens are, for example, Jupiter has moons and the Milky Way is made of many, many stars, he used that set of discoveries as a job application to get a job at court in Florence, working as court mathematician for the Grand Duke of Tuscany. And then, working at the Medici court, he began to publish on the truth of the Copernican system. Kepler, same story. Kepler works eventually as court mathematician for the Holy Roman Emperor. And while there, he publishes more and more dramatic and extraordinary accounts of how the heavens really are. So the association between courts and the astronomical revolution, if it's a phrase we want to use, is very, very close. And in those cases, we're talking about direct patronage, something more than enabling, resourcing, and above all, I would say, legitimating novelty. It's not perhaps an association we might think of too strongly, the association between the Renaissance state and the cultivation of legitimate novelty, but that absolutely is what happens in the case of astronomy. A second example is warfare. Warfare is probably the single most important cause of the emergence of new knowledge in the 1500s and 1600s, partly because of the techniques that what some historians call the military revolution. This is a period when the phrase revolution proliferates in what historians say, well, the military revolution is centered on this new technology, artillery, gunnery, ballistics. And associated with that is the idea that nature itself is a ballistic system. Up till then, that was an unthinkable thought. Nature is surely, in the Middle Ages, rather an organic system. It grows, it comes into being and passes away. The principles that govern motion, change in the world are the principles of life and growth. That's not how it is in the mechanical philosophy. In the mechanical philosophy, nature is essentially a battlefield with a very, very, very large number of cannonballs flying around in all directions, and that is going to be how natural philosophers will explain all natural effects, including ultimately those of living beings. So living beings will come to be seen as organized systems of ballistic motion. That's how it is in Descartes. So I think that change in worldview can well be associated with what's happening on the battlefield, what's happening in warfare. And more generally, we've already mentioned European experience of an encounter with the new. Well, the experience of an encounter with the new is essentially a military exercise. The immense investment by European corporations, trading corporations, the East India Company leaps to mind, and states in the combination of the wooden ship and the gun is what makes the encounter with the new possible. So the feedback system between public and corporate investment in the technologies of navigation and gunnery and the emergence of and possibility of thinking the new is, in my view, direct, absolutely direct.
That earlier medieval view of how the cosmos was organized, it was organic, it grew. That view was also hierarchical. That there were the heavens, they were up there, we were down here on earth. The fall, which we've talked about, this image of rise and fall, there's up and down. The universal structures that organized the world, the down here, the church, the Holy Roman Empire, these were deeply hierarchical structures. They had universal claims. The church had a claim to be the universal church, but no one would think that that universality was also egalitarian. Yet there are aspects of what we have been talking about, as well as all the ways in which it might reinforce not those structures, but the new structures of hierarchical power, imperial power, the power of the new courts, military power, and so on. There is also, isn't there, some sense in which this new universal language, this new way of trying to make sense of nature as it really is, rather than simply coming up with nice patterns of it, regardless of whether or not they're true, is a sort of solvent of hierarchy. Those old medieval or ancient hierarchies, Platonic, religious, whatever they are, where to understand the world is to understand your place in it. You're up or down. You're somewhere in a ladder of knowledge and understanding. And the scientific revolution, at least potentially, was the thing that undid all of that. At the same time, as you've just described, as both reinforcing existing hierarchies and creating new ones. Is that also the thing that I've just described, something else that we should put to one side as overly part of that mythological story of the scientific revolution as the thing that created the world that we live in now? That I still have a lingering feeling that something in this story was going to undo existing hierarchies and create the possibility of a world of a new leveler, more level playing field form of knowledge? Or is that naive too?
It's not naive to associate ways of reorganizing the machineries of knowledge making, the system of communication and authority on which it would rely, with various versions of individualism. That's clearly not wrong. So that what one sees in a great deal of the writing about method, and some, by no means all, writing about cosmology, about how the universe is structured, what one sees in the period that we've been thinking about is undoubtedly a sense of the equivalence of the elements out of which the world is made. That a good way of thinking about it is to think about what can be substituted for what. So early modern European learned writings on these matters very often do the thought experiment of asking, how would this look if I were there? It's an extremely important question. Now, of course, that question is already asked in the Middle Ages. The greatest text in European literature, Dante's Divine Comedy, is, after all, a text which asks, how would the world look if I was somewhere else? That is the point of the Divine Comedy. But the circumstances under which the traveller can see how things are, and the extent to which that traveller, that person put elsewhere, needs or does not need a guide, is absolutely what's crucial here. can one see this for oneself in isolation without a guide, without authority, without any resource or help on which to draw? The contrast, for example, between the Divine Comedy and Pilgrim's Progress is very interesting in this respect. What is experience and what is not? How does allegory work? What is directly experienced? What is the function of the guide? What are the ethics of experience? Above all, what is the role of the individual? That's one way of getting at that. Perhaps a more important, for me anyway, more important question is, surely hierarchy is not undermined by the processes that we're thinking about when we're thinking about the material to which the scientific revolution refers. But hierarchy has changed, and changed massively. So that whereas, for example, it might be said that during the period we've been thinking about, the hierarchy is organized around creed, around religious belief. By the end of our period, certainly by the late 18th century, the hierarchy is definitely organized, amongst other things, around two features, both of which come from the sciences. One is technology, and the other is human nature. So the science of technique is now taken to be what it is that distinguishes Europeans from everybody else. And that form of Euro-suprematism, associated as it will be with technological dominance, begins to appear quite significantly by the second half of the 1700s, and then massively from 1800. And it's clearly associated with many of the changes the phrase scientific revolution is supposed to pick out. So the relation scientific revolution, industrial revolution goes along with an ideology of European dominance, which is completely hierarchical and historically inaccurate in many, many ways. The other is the emergence of the science of race. And that plays an absolutely fundamental role in most of the debates that we've been talking about, in which it's argued that what the sciences demonstrate is a racial hierarchy. This is a new kind of story which both adapts, regrounds on the one hand, but also in very important ways changes the relation between scriptural history and natural history. So by the end of our period, we have what you might call a museology of racial hierarchy, in which these hierarchies are put on show. And they're shown by showing bodies, they're shown by showing skulls, they're shown by showing works of art and works of technique in collections on the street, in posters, in handbooks, in school books, and so on. So I agree that there are really, really important themes of individualism and anti-hierarchical projects present within the ways of knowing of the new philosophy. And in the same movement, completely new and massively reinforced forms of hierarchy also appear. And that irony, again, matters a lot now and then.
So that then leads to the last question, which is where we started, which is, I'm not going to ask you why wasn't there a scientific revolution in China, but rather, in the end, actually, should we conclude that the phrase, the idea of the scientific revolution is much more a product of some of the things that you were just describing, of European dominance, European expansion, European military conquest, and we rolled all those things up together. So it is indeed a very European phenomenon, not because we Europeans discovered how to understand the world for what it really is, but because we wrap that project up with our growing power and dominance in other spheres too. And so that we should think about the scientific revolution as a quintessentially European phenomenon, not because we got smarter quicker than other people did, but because it was part of the process by which we got to tell the dominant story of the modern age.
The irony is very, very striking. This is not, after all, to put it mildly, the only example of a term in the history of ideas which it turns out, the more you think about it, reveals more about the people who invent the term than the events to which the term is applied. The scientific revolution takes its place alongside a whole slew of such terms, like Renaissance, for example, another 19th century invention. So it's absolutely unsurprising, it seems to me, that the scientific revolution turns out to tell us a great deal about the moment when the phrase was invented and about the groups of people who invented it and their cultural interests and their purposes, and that they were urging the dominance of a particular version of European history in a global context, precisely at a moment when that was at stake, when it was in crisis, during epochs of world wars and economic collapse. That also seems to me to be completely unsurprising. On the other hand, the phenomena to which the label of the scientific revolution has been applied are themselves phenomena that, however we want to characterize them, must be taken as historically absolutely crucial. So historians of ideas will always say, well, it's much more complicated. But in this case, the complexity is part of the story we're trying to explain. The way in which any account of the non-human world can be constructed and then defines its relationships with human affairs is an absolutely fundamental issue. And what early modern Europeans were trying to do was to work out ways of welding together art, techne, with experience and learning in a way that they felt would further human welfare. And I think there's a lot to learn from what they managed to do, just as there's a great deal to learn from what they clearly failed dismally to do.
A reminder that if you would like to hear our most recent bonus episode, which is the second part of my conversation with Alec Rowry about the Reformation, this one about Calvin and Calvinism, a really wide-ranging conversation that goes all the way from Geneva in the 16th century to apartheid South Africa in the 20th. It's available now on PPF Plus, and to subscribe, just go to our website, ppfideas.com, or click on the link in the show description. Coming next on the history of revolutionary ideas, I'm going to be talking to the historian Claire Jackson about two political revolutions. They both happened in the same country. They both happened in the same century. The country is England. The century is the 17th. The English Civil War, and then the Glorious Revolution. What were the ideas lying behind them, and what were their consequences? Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books. Past, Present, Future is part of the Airwave podcast network.